The humble beginning, the story of John Davison Rockefeller, does not begin in marble halls or golden offices. It begins in a small wooden house in Richford, New York. On a July morning in 1839, the air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and the family into which he was born was far from wealthy. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a man with many masks, sometimes a traveling salesman peddling miracle tonics, sometimes a trickster known for cutting corners, and sometimes a figure who disappeared for weeks. Two neighbors, he was charming but untrustworthy. To young John, he was a shadow always present in memory, rarely in body. His mother, Eliza, was the opposite. A woman of deep Baptist faith, she kept her children close to the values of honesty, hard work, and thrift. She taught them to stretch every penny, to waste nothing, and to live modestly. She read scripture to them at night, her voice calm and steady in the glow of the oil lamp. While William lived on shifting sands, Eliza built her world on discipline and prayer. John, watching both parents, absorbed the contrast. From his father, he learned cunning and boldness. From his mother, restraint and morality. Together, these two forces formed the paradox at the heart of his life. As a child, John was quiet, serious, and watchful. While other boys laughed in fields or fought over marbles, he preferred to count. He counted his toys, the eggs from the hens, and the few coins he earned by helping neighbors. Even then, he was fascinated by order, the way numbers could build a story of gain or loss, success or ruin. When he was 7, he famously lent small amounts of money to other children and charged interest. They thought it was a game. John thought it was education. He began keeping a ledger where every cent was recorded. The little book became his secret treasure, a map of what life could become if one remained disciplined. But poverty has a way of shaping character more firmly than any parent's lecture. There were nights when food was simple bread and milk, and winters when coal was scarce. John knew what it felt like to live with uncertainty, to wonder if his father would return with money or vanish again. He learned early that the world did not give security freely. It had to be built, brick by brick, with relentless effort. That sense of vulnerability forged in him a hunger not for luxury, but for stability and control. At the age of 16, he found work as an assistant bookkeeper. In Cleveland, the office was modest. Wooden desks lined with inkwells, clerks hunched over ledgers, the air filled with the scent of oil lamps and damp paper. But for John, it was a cathedral of numbers. He loved the neatness of accounts, the exactness of balancing books. His salary was small, yet he saved a portion of every dollar, placing it carefully in his ledger as if each coin were a soldier in his private army of discipline. While his colleagues dreamed of quick profits, John dreamed of consistency. He had no taste for gambling or risk. His motto was simple: don't be afraid to give up the good to go for the great. And yet, the greatness he sought was not flamboyant. It was quiet, steady, inevitable. He imagined ships moving across lakes, warehouses filled with goods, partnerships sealed with trust, and most of all, wealth that would last through storms. Still, behind this careful discipline lay a boy who longed for recognition. He walked past grand houses in Cleveland and wondered what it would take to step into such a life. He watched merchants close deals at bustling markets and felt the ache to prove that he too could shape the world. Yet his ambition was wrapped in silence. He was not loud, not flashy. His power would always come from moving quietly, like water carving stone, slowly but permanently. There is an often told story of how, as a teenager, he lent a neighbor $50 money, painstakingly saved, and, when it was repaid with interest, John felt a thrill greater than any child's play. He realized that money could grow, could multiply if tended with care, like seeds in fertile soil. From that moment, finance became not just necessity but art. He vowed to himself, with a gravity rare in youth, "I will be rich." The vow was not shouted but whispered, recorded in his heart like a promise to destiny. He believed that God favored order, that hard work was a form of worship, and that wealth, if managed with wisdom, was not sin but stewardship. These beliefs, planted in his youth, would later become the justification for an empire that transformed America itself. That's the 1850s rolled on. America was changing. Railroads crisscrossed the land, factories belched smoke, and cities swelled with opportunity. Cleveland, perched on the edge of Lake Erie, became a hub of trade and industry. It was there, in this young and restless city, that John Rockefeller sharpened his skills and waited for the right moment to act. He was not yet a titan, not yet the feared and admired billionaire the world would know. But the boy with the worn shoes and the leather ledger had already taken his first steps. The seeds of empire had been planted, though few could see them, and in the shadows of his humble beginning, John Rockefeller carried a secret. He was not merely trying to survive poverty, he was preparing to master the world. The first fortune by the time John D. Rockefeller turned 19. Cleveland was no longer just a quiet city by the lake. The air was heavy with the sound of hammers striking steel, wagons creaking under loads of grain, and ships docking with goods that fed a restless nation. The Civil War was creeping closer, and every corner of America buzzed with urgency. In the middle of this storm, Rockefeller stood at the edge of adulthood, calm, calculating, and already older in spirit than his years suggested. His first real venture began in partnership with Morris B. Clark, a man older and more impulsive than John, but willing to take chances. Together, they started a business supplying produce, grain, meat, and salt. The venture was modest, but John approached it as if the survival of nations depended on every transaction. He negotiated hard with farmers, demanded reliability from transporters, and refused to leave a single figure unbalanced in his ledgers. When the war finally erupted, opportunity struck with a force no one could ignore. Armies needed food, clothing, and supplies. Prices soared, contracts multiplied, and profits poured in. While other young men rushed to the battlefield, Rockefeller chose to fight his war on the front lines of commerce. To him, building stability for his family and securing his vision of greatness was just as patriotic as carrying a rifle. Yet, his decision drew whispers. Some accused him of being cold, of choosing money over duty. But John held fast to his quiet belief: I can serve best by creating order where there is chaos. The profits from those war years gave him a taste of something he had long dreamed of: security. But more than that, it gave him capital, and with capital came freedom. Still, he was not satisfied. Food and grain were important, but Rockefeller's eyes began to wander toward something strange, risky, and promising: oil. The oil boom had begun in Pennsylvania only a few years earlier, when Edwin Drake drilled the first successful well in 1859. What followed was a frenzy that looked more like a gold rush than a proper industry. Thousands of wildcatters drilled wherever they could, hoping to strike black liquid wealth. The oil would be pumped, stored in barrels, and sent off in rickety wagons. Fortune came fast, but so did ruin. Wells went dry. Fires destroyed entire towns. Prices swung wildly from week to week. To most men, it was madness. To Rockefeller, it was destiny. He saw something no one else seemed to notice. Oil was not just a gamble, it was the future. Every lamp in America needed kerosene. Factories, cities, households, everyone would demand light. And in that light, John saw his path. In 1863, Rockefeller made his first investment in an oil refinery. It was not glamorous. The refinery sat on the banks of the Cuyahoga River, a place that stank of smoke and spilled petroleum. Workers covered in soot-hauled barrels day and night. Fires were common, and the river itself often carried a sheen of oil across its waters. But while others complained of the mess, John smiled. To him, every drop of oil meant possibility. The refinery became his obsession. He watched the process carefully, learning each detail: distillation, storage, transportation. He demanded efficiency, order, and reliability. Waste angered him more than failure. Cut costs, improve quality, reinvest profits, he told his partners, as if the words were scripture. He was not just producing kerosene, he was creating a system. Rockefeller had a gift for seeing connections where others saw fragments. He realized that the real profits were not only in drilling oil, but in refining and controlling its path to market. Why depend on the uncertain luck of striking oil when he could perfect the art of refining it? Why leave distribution to middlemen when he could manage transportation himself? Piece by piece, he began weaving a web of control, though at this stage it was only the beginning. His seriousness, however, clashed with his partner Clark's impulsiveness. Clark wanted faster profits, quicker deals, and less caution. John wanted method, long-term vision, and absolute control. Their partnership grew tense. Eventually, in a fateful auction, Rockefeller bought Clark out for $72,500, staggering sum at the time. With that single move, John took sole command of the refinery and his destiny. Later, he would remember that decision as one of the greatest risks of his life, the moment where he stood at a crossroads and chose empire over comfort. By the end of the 1860s, Rockefeller's refinery was one of the largest in Cleveland. Ships carried his kerosene across the Great Lakes, merchants stocked it in cities, and families lit their homes with it. Slowly, quietly, his influence spread, but the young businessman was not content. He could feel it. This was only the first chapter. Oil was still disorganized, chaotic, wasteful, and John, with his quiet ledger and steady gaze, was determined to impose order on it all. Every evening, after returning from the refinery, Rockefeller would sit in his study, recording numbers, reviewing accounts, and praying softly. He did not flaunt wealth. He dressed plainly, lived simply, and avoided attention. Yet inside him burned an ambition as vast as America itself. He wanted not just success but permanence. He wanted to build something that would outlive him, something so immense that no crisis could shake it. The boy who once lent pennies to neighbors had now taken his first fortune from war and turned it into a stake in oil. The gamble had paid off. But Rockefeller's secret strength was that he did not view it as a gamble at all. To him, oil was not chaos, it was the foundation of a new age, and he, John Davison Rockefeller, intended to be its architect. The rise of Standard Oil. The year was 1870. Cleveland had grown noisier, its streets filled with wagons hauling barrels of crude, men shouting orders at the docks, and chimneys pouring smoke into the sky. The oil industry had become a feverish scramble. Every week, new wells appeared. Every week, prices rose and fell like a storm-tossed sea. Fortunes were made in a day and lost the next. To most men, it was exhilarating, a gamble where boldness might bring wealth. But to John D. Rockefeller, it was intolerable. Chaos offended him, waste disgusted him. Inconsistency was his enemy. If oil was to be the fuel of the future, it needed order, discipline, and a master hand. Rockefeller was determined to be that hand. That year, he formed a new company with several trusted partners. They called it Standard Oil. The name itself revealed his vision, not wild, not reckless, but standard, a mark of reliability, quality, and consistency in a world drowning in uncertainty. What others saw as a gamble, John saw as an empire waiting to be organized. From the start, Standard Oil was not just a company, it was a system. Rockefeller demanded efficiency at every level. Refineries under his control operated with precision. Waste products were reused, barrels sealed tightly, transportation streamlined. Even the byproducts, paraffin, wax, lubricants, petroleum jelly, were sold, turning scraps into profit. Nothing was wasted. Workers joked that Rockefeller could squeeze $1 from a drop of oil, and in many ways, it was true. But efficiency was only part of his genius. The other was strategy. Rockefeller believed in growth, not by chance but by design. He began buying out smaller refiners in Cleveland, often quietly, sometimes ruthlessly. He offered fair sums to those willing to sell and used pressure on those who resisted. His calm demeanor never broke, even when competitors called him a predator. In meetings, he would lean forward with his steady gaze and say in a low, unshakable voice, "You can either sell to us now or be destroyed by the market later. We are building for the future." Many gave in. Those who refused often found themselves crushed by falling prices, cut off from railroads, or unable to compete with Standard's growing power. Rockefeller was not cruel in appearance. He rarely raised his voice, and he did not flaunt arrogance. Yet his methods were relentless. He believed consolidation was not only smart business, but moral duty. Chaos wasted resources, and waste, to him, was almost sinful. The secret weapon behind Standard Oil's rise was transportation. Railroads were the arteries of the oil industry, carrying barrels from Cleveland to New York, from Pennsylvania to Chicago. Rockefeller knew that whoever controlled transportation would control oil itself. He negotiated with railroad companies with the same calm intensity he applied to everything else. But where others begged for lower rates, Rockefeller demanded rebate secret deals that refunded part of the shipping costs to Standard Oil. This gave him a massive advantage over rivals, who paid full price while Rockefeller's costs shrank. These secret deals became legendary and infamous. Competitors raged, newspapers began to take notice, and whispers spread of Rockefeller's growing stranglehold on the industry. Yet, the more criticism rose, the stronger Standard Oil grew. By the mid-1870s, Rockefeller controlled nearly every refinery in Cleveland. Observers called it the Cleveland Massacre, though not a shot had been fired. It was conquest by ledger, by patience, by iron discipline. Despite his growing power, Rockefeller lived modestly. He dressed simply, spoke softly, and continued his lifelong habit of recording every cent in his ledger. At home, he prayed with his family, read scripture, and reminded his children of the importance of humility. Outsiders were baffled. How could the man accused of being the most ruthless businessman in America also be a devout Baptist who gave generously to his church? To Rockefeller, there was no contradiction. He believed he was chosen by God to bring order to industry, to tame chaos, and to use wealth as a tool for greater good. Still, cracks were forming. The public began to view Standard Oil not as a company, but as a machine swallowing everything in its path. Competitors branded Rockefeller a monopolist, a tyrant, a man who crushed the dreams of smaller refiners in pursuit of endless power. Yet John remained unmoved. To him, the attacks were the cries of those who failed to see the bigger picture. He once said, almost coldly, "Competition is a sin." By 1880, Standard Oil refined nearly 90% of America's kerosene. From city lamps to rural homes, from factories to railroads, light itself was tied to Rockefeller's empire. The boy who once counted pennies in a leather ledger had become the master of an industry, and yet he remained strangely private, his life a blend of devotion, secrecy, and ambition. Every night, when Cleveland slept, Rockefeller would sit at his desk, the flame of an oil lamp flickering against his face, and review the numbers. To him, the numbers were not just profits, they were proof of destiny. They told him the world was being reshaped, and that his hand was on the lever. He did not laugh, did not boast, did not rest, for in his mind, Standard Oil was only the beginning. Rockefeller had built an empire of oil, but he wanted something greater, an empire of permanence. The world would not know it yet, but America's first billionaire was already crafting a legacy so vast it would ignite admiration, fear, and debate for generations. The empire and the storm. By the late 1880s, John D. Rockefeller no longer controlled just a company, he controlled an empire. From Cleveland to New York, from Chicago to Pittsburgh, the name Standard Oil whispered through boardrooms and echoed in the streets. In nearly every American household, lamps burned with kerosene that flowed from Rockefeller's refineries. Railroads, barges, warehouses, and pipelines all bent toward his will. For many Americans, Rockefeller was not simply a businessman, he was the oil itself. But with great power came suspicion, and with suspicion came enemies. The newspapers began to write about him. At first, they marveled at the scale of his achievement, how a man who started with nothing but discipline and faith had risen to command the most powerful business in America. But admiration quickly turned to unease. Competitors who had once sold proudly in local markets were gone, swallowed up or crushed under the weight of Standard Oil. Small refiners called him a tyrant. Farmers called him a manipulator, and the public began to whisper a new word, monopoly. In the press, Rockefeller was painted as a shadowy figure, moving silently through smoke-filled rooms, pulling invisible strings that determined prices across the nation. He became both feared and resented. Families lit their lamps with Standard kerosene every evening, yet cursed the company that provided it. The irony was sharp. Rockefeller's oil gave America light, but his methods cast him in shadow. Inside the empire, however, Rockefeller remained calm. He continued his habit of rising early, attending church, reading scripture, and recording every detail in his ledger. He walked through his offices with the same plain suit, the same controlled manner, his voice quiet but commanding. To his employees, he was both distant and fatherly. He rarely shouted, but when he spoke, men listened. His word carried the weight of iron. The secret of his success was not just efficiency, but control. Rockefeller believed that stability in oil required unity, and unity required dominance. He built secret alliances with railroads to secure rebates. He expanded pipelines to cut off competitors, and he formed a complex system of trusts to hide the full extent of his reach. It was brilliant, but it was also dangerous. By 1882, Standard Oil had become the first great American trust. Dozens of companies, refineries, transport lines, warehouses were bound together under a single board of trustees, with Rockefeller at the helm. It was a structure unlike anything seen before, allowing him to command vast industries as one body. While the public still saw many independent companies, the truth was that they were all part of Standard Oil's web. The trust terrified the nation. Politicians began to question whether one man should hold such power. Farmers protested that Rockefeller dictated the price of kerosene and squeezed them dry. Competitors accused him of ruthless tactics, of buying judges, of controlling legislatures. Whether all the accusations were true did not matter. The image of Rockefeller as an untouchable monarch of oil was now fixed in the American imagination. And yet, Rockefeller himself seemed immune to the storm. He believed that what he was building was not tyranny but order. To him, competition was wasteful, duplication was foolish, and chaos was sinful. If America was to prosper, it needed stability, and only Standard Oil could provide it. He once remarked, with his usual calm, "The day of combination is here to stay. Individualism has gone, never to return." But outside the marble offices of Standard, anger grew louder. In 1881, a fearless reporter named Ida Tarbell began her investigation into Rockefeller's empire. Her father had once been ruined by Standard's tactics, and she carried that memory like a wound. For years, she collected stories, documents, and testimonies from those who had faced Rockefeller's quiet wrath. In her articles, later compiled into the history of the Standard Oil Company, she portrayed Rockefeller not as a genius of efficiency, but as a man who schemed in shadows, crushing small men for profit. Her words struck deep, and the American public began to see him not as a builder, but as a predator. The government could no longer ignore the cries. Politicians, once quiet under Standard's influence, began calling for new laws to curb the power of trusts. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was born from that anger, a law designed to break monopolies and restore competition. Though the act at first lacked teeth, it signaled a turning tide. For the first time, the machinery of government had turned its gaze fully on Rockefeller. Yet, even as storms gathered, Rockefeller's empire reached its peak. Standard Oil controlled more than 90% of America's refining capacity. Its reach stretched beyond the United States, exporting kerosene to Europe and Asia, lighting streets in London and homes in China. Rockefeller was no longer just America's oil king, he was a global force. But at night, in his private study, John D. Rockefeller felt the weight of the world shifting. He read the newspapers that vilified him, the speeches of politicians condemning trusts, the reports of investigators digging into his deals. He prayed more often, clinging to the belief that he was chosen for this work. Yet deep inside, he knew that no empire, no matter how disciplined, no matter how secret, could remain unchallenged forever. The empire stood tall, but the storm was coming, and for the first time in his life, John D. Rockefeller would have to face a battle he could not win with ledgers, pipelines, or secret deals. The fall and the transformation. By the dawn of the 20th century, John D. Rockefeller was no longer just a businessman, he was a legend, a ghostly figure whose name evoked both awe and anger. Standard Oil had grown into the largest and most feared corporation in the world, controlling pipelines, refineries, warehouses, railroads, and markets across continents. Families lit their lamps with his kerosene. Factories relied on his lubricants. Traders whispered his name as if he were less a man and more a force of nature. But empires, no matter how powerful, eventually meet resistance. For years, Rockefeller had built his fortress in silence, always careful, always disciplined. But his methods, secret rebates, crushing competitors, weaving companies into hidden trusts, had sparked a fire he could not extinguish. Reporters, reformers, and politicians united in a cry: no single man should hold such power. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 had been aimed directly at him, though at first its teeth were dull. But as the new century began, public anger sharpened. The blade, the real strike, came in 1906, when the U.S. government, under President Theodore Roosevelt's trust-busting agenda, filed a lawsuit against Standard Oil. The case shook the nation. Suddenly, Rockefeller's empire, which had seemed untouchable, stood trial before the law. For months, the courtroom echoed with accusations: unfair practices, price fixing, secret deals. Witnesses described the way Standard had cornered markets, how small refiners had been forced out, how railroads had bent under Rockefeller's will. The press devoured every detail. Headlines screamed of corruption, monopoly, and greed. Cartoons in newspapers portrayed Rockefeller as an octopus, its tentacles strangling the globe, pipelines coiled like serpents around the throats of common men. To the public, he was no longer just a businessman, he was a villain, the dark face of capitalism. And yet, Rockefeller himself remained strangely calm. By then, he was in his late 60s, his health declining, his hair gone thin and grey. He no longer spent his days in the offices of Standard. Instead, he lived quietly at his estate in Pocantico Hills, New York, walking the gardens, reading his Bible, and meeting occasionally with trusted associates. When reporters tried to question him about the lawsuit, he often smiled politely, tipped his hat, and walked away. His silence only deepened the mystery. In 1911, the verdict finally came. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil had violated antitrust laws and must be broken up. The empire Rockefeller had built with such relentless discipline was to be dismantled into 34 separate companies. For the first time in decades, the name Standard Oil trembled to the public. It was a triumph. The giant had been slain, the monopoly shattered, the marketplace freed. Crowds celebrated. Newspapers hailed the decision as a victory for democracy. Many assumed that Rockefeller, now stripped of his empire, would wither into obscurity, a defeated king mourning the ruins of his castle, but they underestimated him. What few realized was that Rockefeller still owned the shares of Standard Oil. When the company broke apart, those shares multiplied suddenly. He held stock in 34 companies instead of one. Ironically, the breakup made him richer than ever. The man the government had tried to humble quietly became the world's first billionaire. Even in defeat, John D. Rockefeller had found victory, and yet, something had shifted inside him. Perhaps it was age, perhaps it was the long years of criticism, perhaps it was the pull of his mother's teachings, but Rockefeller began to turn his immense fortune toward something unexpected: philanthropy. He gave away money with the same discipline with which he had once built Standard Oil, but his giving was not careless charity. It was strategic, organized, and vast. He founded the University of Chicago, transforming it into one of America's leading institutions. He established the Rockefeller Foundation, which funded medical research, public health, and education around the world. His wealth helped fight diseases like hookworm and yellow fever, saving millions of lives. To the world, this transformation was astonishing. The man once branded a ruthless monopolist was now called a benefactor, a philanthropist, even a saint by some. But those who knew him well understood that it was not a transformation at all. It was simply another expression of his belief in order and efficiency. Just as he hated waste in business, he hated waste in human suffering. Wealth, he believed, was a trust from God, meant to be used wisely, not squandered. "The man who dies rich dies disgraced," he once said. Still, not everyone forgave him. Many continued to see him as a figure of contradiction, a devout Baptist who had crushed competitors, a ruthless capitalist who became the greatest giver of his age. His image never fully healed, but his impact was undeniable. Rockefeller had reshaped America twice, once through oil, and once through philanthropy. By the time the world called him its first billionaire, Rockefeller no longer cared for titles. He spent his last years in quiet reflection, tending to his gardens, giving dimes to children he met on his walks, and smiling with the serenity of a man who had fought his battles and accepted his place in history. The empire had fallen, but the man had transformed, and in that transformation lay one of the greatest secrets of his life, that John D. Rockefeller's true legacy was not just in oil, but in how he used the wealth it brought to change the world. He hidden legacy. In the summer of 1937, on a quiet day in Florida, John Davison Rockefeller drew his final breath at the age of 97. The man who had once been the most feared capitalist in America left the world not in the middle of a storm, but in silence. By then, the empire he had built, dismantled, and reshaped had already outlived him. But the question lingered: what, truly, was the legacy of America's first billionaire? To understand it, one must look beyond the headlines of monopolies and the triumphs of philanthropy. One must step into the secret, private rhythms of Rockefeller's life habits that revealed the man behind the empire. He was a billionaire who lived as though he was still the boy saving pennies in a worn ledger. He rose at dawn, kept a strict diet, and avoided excess. He was known to carry a small notebook everywhere, recording his expenses with a precision bordering on obsession. Even in his richest years, he sometimes wore the same suit for days and counted every dime he gave away as carefully as every dollar he earned. His life was a paradox. Immense wealth paired with relentless simplicity. In public, he was almost invisible. He disliked speeches, avoided photographs, and shunned the flamboyance of his peers. While other magnates flaunted mansions and yachts, Rockefeller lived with quiet restraint. Guests at his home often remarked on the lack of extravagance. The halls were calm, the furniture plain, the meals modest. Wealth, for him, was never about glitter, it was about control, order, and legacy. And yet, his control extended into realms few could see. He donated millions to science, but not randomly. He built institutions that could last generations: the Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, the University of Chicago, and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University. Through these, his wealth seeded discoveries that changed history, funding the research that led to vaccines, eradicating diseases like hookworm, and supporting breakthroughs in medicine and education. If Standard Oil gave America light in its lamps, Rockefeller's philanthropy gave light to the world's future. But the man himself remained a mystery. To some, he was a saint. To others, a robber baron who cloaked his sins in generosity. Workers who had been crushed by Standard Oil's rise never forgot the ruthless efficiency with which he had conquered their livelihoods. Journalists like Ida Tarbell painted him as a man who preyed on the weak, but millions of others remembered him as the benefactor who built schools in their towns, hospitals in their cities, and institutions that opened doors to knowledge. Perhaps the greatest paradox of John D. Rockefeller was not in his wealth, but in his faith. A devout Baptist, he gave regularly to his church, sang hymns with his family, and taught his children the value of humility. He believed his fortune was not truly his own, but entrusted to him by God for greater purpose. His favorite hymn, Rock of Ages, was often heard in his home, sung in the same quiet voice that once delivered orders to boardrooms. For Rockefeller, business and faith were not separate worlds, but threads of the same tapestry. Order in business, he believed, was service to God. Generosity in wealth was obedience to Scripture. Even in old age, when his hair had turned white and his back bent with years, Rockefeller carried himself with the same calm intensity that marked his youth. He was often seen giving shiny dimes. 2 children he met on his walks, a small act, yet symbolic of a lifetime of watching every coin, every cent, every decision. The children would laugh, their pockets jingling with his gift, never realizing that the old man handing them coins was the richest man alive. When he passed, the world struggled to decide how to remember him. Was he the villainous man, the octopus of oil who strangled competition? Or was he the visionary philanthropist who gave away more than $500 million and changed the course of medicine and education? The truth, perhaps, was that he was both, a man of ruthless precision and quiet devotion, ambition and restraint, shadow and light. And yet there is something timeless in his story. Rockefeller was born into poverty, raised by a strict mother and an absent father, and carved his empire with nothing but discipline, vision, and unshakable belief in order. He built an industry from chaos, endured the wrath of public opinion, faced the hammer of government, and still emerged as the world's first billionaire. In his triumphs and his contradictions, he embodied the relentless spirit of America itself, ambitious, flawed, but determined to leave a mark. Today, when we speak of billionaires, of fortunes that shape nations and influence history, we are still living in the shadow of John D. Rockefeller. His name remains a symbol, a warning, and an inspiration all at once. He showed the world the danger of unchecked power, but also the possibility of wealth as a tool for progress. His life was a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the darkness of human ambition. As the lamps of his era burned out and electric light replaced kerosene, Rockefeller's empire faded into history. But his legacy endures not in oil barrels or monopolies, but in schools, hospitals, research labs, and in the very idea that money, when directed with purpose, can outlive its maker. In the end, the secret life of John D. Rockefeller was not hidden in ledgers or trusts, but in the paradox he carried to his grave, that the same hand that built an empire of ruthless power also built foundations of hope that still light the world today.